My wife asked for a divorce after 40 years of marriage. She stood in our kitchen and said she wanted the house, the cars, and the company. She wanted everything except our son. My lawyer begged me to fight her in court. I looked at him and said, "Give it all to her." Everyone thought I had lost my mind. At the final hearing, I signed everything over to her name. She smirked, thinking she had ruined me. She did not know I had already won. She smiled until her lawyer leaned over and whispered 4 words that destroyed her life. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart someone who tried to take advantage of your silence. I stood in the grand foyer of our sprawling Chicago estate, listening to the heavy thud of footsteps echoing from the master suite upstairs. The house was magnificent, a testament to decades of relentless work. But in that moment, it felt colder than the brutal winter winds sweeping off Lake Michigan. I am Lawrence, 70 years old, a man who built an empire out of concrete steel and sleepless nights. I have never been a man of many words, preferring to let my actions build the foundation of my family's life. But as I listened to the sharp, frantic sound of zippers closing, I knew the foundation I had built for my wife was finally cracking. Barbara came marching down the sweeping, curved staircase. She was 65, but dressed with the aggressive desperation of a woman trying to claw back 2 decades of time. Her arms were laden with heavy designer suitcases that probably cost more than my first car. She did not look at me with the history of a woman who had shared a bed with me for 40 years. She looked at me like a landlord inspecting a property she was about to demolish. There was no hesitation in her stride, no warmth in her eyes, only a calculated urgency. She walked straight past me and dropped a thick stack of legal documents onto the polished marble of our kitchen island. The heavy thud of the paper seemed to echo through the empty, cavernous rooms of the main house. I slowly walked over to the island, staring down at the bold black letters printed across the top page. Petition for dissolution of marriage. It was not entirely a surprise, but the physical reality of seeing it sitting next to the coffee maker where we used to read the morning paper was jarring. I looked up at her, waiting for the explanation I knew she had been rehearsing in her head for months. I did not raise my voice or ask for reasons. I have negotiated enough hostile corporate takeovers to know that the first one to lose their temper is the first one to lose the war. I simply watched her adjust her silk scarf, her eyes cold and unapologetic. She was waiting for me to react, waiting for the predictable anger of a discarded husband, but I gave her nothing but silence. Her dialogue came out sharp, rehearsed, and cruel. She did not bother with pleasantries or fake apologies. She told me she was leaving me for a venture capitalist, a man 15 years younger than me, who spent his days chasing tech startups instead of managing brick-and-mortar real estate. She said she was tired of the slow, methodical pace of my life. She wanted excitement, she wanted travel, and more importantly, she wanted her share of the empire she felt she had patiently endured for decades. She tapped a perfectly manicured finger against the thick stack of divorce papers. She explicitly laid out her demands without a shred of hesitation. She wanted this main estate, the multi-million-dollar property in the most exclusive suburb of Chicago. She demanded the entire luxury car collection sitting in our climate-controlled garages. And most boldly, she demanded total ownership of Midwest Horizon LLC, the commercial real estate holding company that served as the crown jewel of my life's work. I listened to her rattle off the demands as if she were ordering from a menu. She spoke about the assets with a deep fundamental arrogance, assuming that because her name was loosely attached to the marital estate, she had earned the right to simply walk away with the gross value of my decades of labor. She looked at me with a condescending smirk, challenging me to argue with her, challenging me to tell her she was being unreasonable. But I kept my expression entirely neutral, absorbing the sheer scale of her greed. Then she crossed a line that transformed my silent resignation into a cold, unbreakable resolve. I asked her a simple question about the logistics of her demands. I asked her what she planned to do about our son. Eric is 38 years old. 6 months ago, he was involved in a horrific car crash that nearly took his life. He survived, but the damage to his spine and nervous system was catastrophic. He currently lives in the custom retrofitted guest house on the edge of our property, requiring round-the-clock care and intensive expensive physical therapy to ever have a hope of walking again. Barbara let out a harsh, bitter sigh, rolling her eyes, as if I had just brought up a minor inconvenience like a leaky roof. She crossed her arms and explicitly refused to take on any financial or physical responsibility for him. She looked me dead in the eye and called our own son a bottomless money pit. She said that his medical bills were draining the liquid cash accounts, and that his presence was a depressing anchor holding her back from her new, glamorous life. She told me I was a fool for paying for his specialized therapy when he was likely never going to fully recover anyway. The air in the kitchen turned to ice. A father can endure the betrayal of a wife, he can endure the loss of a house or a car. But hearing the woman who gave birth to his son discard him like a broken piece of furniture was an insult that registered on a cellular level. I looked at her carefully, seeing her not as the woman I married, but as a parasite that needed to be surgically removed from our lives. I did not scream. I did not throw the divorce papers across the room. I did not beg her to reconsider her lack of humanity. I absorbed the insult to my son. I let the horrific reality of her words sink into my bones. This was the trigger. My cold logic, the exact same logic that allowed me to build Midwest Horizon from a single rundown warehouse into a regional powerhouse, kicked in. Anger makes you sloppy. Silence makes you dangerous. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket, pulled out my favorite pen, and leaned over the marble kitchen island. Without a single word of protest, I flipped to the back page and signed the acknowledgement of service. Barbara looked momentarily stunned. She had braced herself for a screaming match, a legal threat, a tearful plea. Instead, I calmly handed her back the document. I told her to have her lawyer contact mine and that we would begin the process immediately. She narrowed her eyes suspiciously, trying to read my expression, but there was nothing for her to read. I turned my back on her and walked toward the back door, heading out toward the guest house to check on Eric. I left her standing in the kitchen, victorious in her own mind, completely unaware of the mechanism she had just activated. As I walked across the manicured lawn toward the guest house, my mind began turning the gears of a plan. I needed to protect my son, and I needed to ensure that Barbara got exactly what she asked for. I built Midwest Horizon from the ground up. I knew every brick, every lease, every zoning law, and every financial loophole attached to those properties. Decades ago, my accountants advised me to add Barbara's name to the primary deeds purely for tax optics and liability shielding. She never attended a board meeting. She never read a profit and loss statement. Barbara lived in a world of pure aesthetics. She believed the assets were purely liquid. She looked at a commercial skyscraper and only saw the gross valuation printed on a tax assessment. She had absolutely no idea how commercial real estate actually functioned. She did not understand commercial leverage, collateralized debt, or the complex interwoven liabilities required to maintain an empire of that size. She wanted the crown, but she had no idea how heavy it was. I stepped into the quiet, sterile environment of the guest house. Eric was asleep in his specialized medical bed, the rhythmic hum of monitors keeping a steady beat. I stood over him, smoothing the blanket over his motionless legs. I promised him silently that he would never have to worry about his care, his therapy, or his future. Barbara wanted to walk away with the physical shell of my life. She wanted the cars, the house, and the corporate name. I smiled a small, dark smile in the quiet room. I was going to give her everything she demanded, down to the very last penny of debt. 2 weeks later, the air inside the conference room of my lawyer felt heavy and suffocating. I sat at the long mahogany table looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the Chicago skyline I had helped build. My attorney, Mr. Foster, paced nervously near the doorway. He was a brilliant legal mind, a man who had guided my company through decades of complex zoning laws and corporate disputes. Yet today, he looked genuinely anxious. He kept adjusting his tie and glancing at the thick file folders sitting in front of my empty chair. He knew the true value of my empire, and he was ready for a brutal and exhausting legal war. I remained seated and perfectly still while sipping a glass of iced water. I had no intention of fighting a war. I was simply waiting for the enemy to step onto the battlefield. The heavy wooden doors swung open, and Barbara walked in. She did not walk like a woman ending a 4-decade marriage. She walked like a celebrity arriving at a red carpet event. She wore a tailored designer suit that screamed expensive, and her chin was tilted upward in an expression of absolute superiority. Following closely behind her was her attorney, Mr. Reed. He was a notorious divorce lawyer in the city known for his ruthless tactics and aggressive courtroom theatricality. He carried a sleek leather briefcase and a smirk that suggested he had already won the case before anyone had even spoken a single word. He pulled out a chair for Barbara and treated her with an exaggerated level of deference before taking his own seat directly across from me. Mr. Reed did not bother with pleasantries. He unlatched his briefcase with a loud click that echoed in the quiet room. He pulled out a massive stack of legal documents and dropped them onto the center of the table. He leaned forward to rest his forearms on the polished wood and locked his eyes on me. He began his opening statement with the tone of a predator cornering wounded prey. He spoke at length about how his client had sacrificed the best years of her life to support a man obsessed with his business. He painted a completely fictional picture of Barbara as the silent architect behind my success and claimed that her emotional labor was the true foundation of my company. He threw out legal jargon and cited precedents to make it very clear that he intended to drain every ounce of energy and money I had left if I dared to oppose them. Mr. Foster tried to intervene and raised a hand to interrupt the aggressive monologue. He stated firmly that we were here to negotiate a fair and equitable division of assets rather than listen to a dramatic performance. Mr. Reed merely chuckled with a dry and abrasive sound. He leaned back in his leather chair and stated that there would be no negotiation. He told my lawyer that they were not here to ask for a fair division. They were here to dictate the terms of my surrender. He slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a finalized list of their demands printed in bold black ink. He wanted me to read it and feel the weight of what they were taking. Mr. Reed outlined the terms with brutal clarity. Barbara demanded 100% of the physical assets. She wanted the primary estate transferred solely into her name by the end of the month. She demanded the titles to the entire luxury car collection, including the vintage models I had restored with my own hands. Finally, and most importantly, she demanded total ownership of Midwest Horizon. He stated that since her name was already on the founding documents, the transfer would be seamless. He paused to let the sheer magnitude of their greed hang in the air before delivering his final blow. Then came the threat. Mr. Reed leaned over the table again, and his voice dropped to a menacing whisper. He told me that if I decided to fight this in court, he would make sure the trial was a public spectacle. He threatened to drag my name through the mud and invite the media into the courtroom to expose every private detail of our marriage to the local news. He said he would make sure my investors saw me as a chaotic and unstable liability. He warned me that a messy public trial would destroy my reputation in the Chicago real estate market and leave me with nothing but legal fees and public humiliation. He presented the complete surrender of my assets as the only way to save my dignity. Barbara finally spoke to twist the knife just to ensure I felt the pain. She looked at me with cold and unapologetic eyes. She stated that she had earned every single brick of that house and every penny in that company. She reiterated that she wanted a completely clean break, free from any obligations. She made it a point to casually mention that the faster I signed the physical assets over to her, the faster she could move on with her new life and leave me to deal with Eric and his medical problems on my own. She smiled a triumphant and greedy smile while fully believing that the threat of a public scandal had cornered me. She assumed my silence was born out of fear and defeat. She had no idea that my silence was the sound of a trap snapping shut. I simply looked at the documents on the table and kept my face entirely blank while waiting for my moment to speak. I looked across the table at the smug faces of my soon-to-be ex-wife and her aggressive attorney. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up. I turned to my lawyer and asked for a brief recess to discuss these terms in private. Mr. Reed let out an arrogant sigh and checked his expensive watch, making a show of how much I was wasting his valuable time. Barbara simply rolled her eyes and crossed her legs, leaning back as if she had already claimed ownership of the room. Mr. Foster immediately gathered his legal pads and followed me into the adjoining private office, closing the heavy oak door firmly behind us. The moment the latch clicked into place, his professional composure completely evaporated. He tossed his files onto a small glass table and began pacing the length of the room, running a frustrated hand through his thinning hair. He was a man who lived for courtroom battles, and he could not believe that I was sitting there in utter silence while a predatory lawyer tried to bully me out of a lifetime of hard work. He looked at me with genuine distress and begged me to let him take the leash off. He wanted to march back into that conference room and tear their ridiculous demands to pieces. Mr. Foster stopped his pacing and pointed a shaking finger toward the closed door. He insisted that every single threat Mr. Reed just made was an absolute bluff designed to scare an old man into submission. He reminded me that we had spent the last 2 weeks compiling mountains of irrefutable evidence. We had financial records proving that Barbara had never set foot inside a Midwest Horizon board meeting. We had documents showing she had never signed a commercial lease or contributed a single hour of labor to the holding company. Beyond the corporate evidence, we had private investigator reports detailing her long-standing infidelity with her new wealthy investor. My lawyer explained that no judge in the state of Illinois would ever look at those facts and award her 100% of the marital assets. He told me that Mr. Reed knew his case was incredibly weak, and that is exactly why they were trying to force a mediation settlement through sheer intimidation. They wanted to avoid a trial because a trial would expose her greed and her complete lack of contribution to the empire she now claimed to own. My attorney pulled out a yellow legal pad and began tapping his pen against the paper to emphasize his points. He broke down the reality of what a court battle would actually look like for us. He assured me with absolute certainty that we could easily secure at least 60% of the entire physical estate. He promised that the judge would recognize my sole operation of the business and protect the commercial holding company from her grasping hands. Furthermore, he explained that we could turn the tables on her completely. Because she was leaving the marriage for a heavily funded venture capitalist and walking away from a disabled son, we could file a motion to force her to pay spousal support. We could legally mandate that she liquidate her own personal luxury assets to contribute to the specialized medical trust for Eric. Mr. Foster was practically vibrating with adrenaline as he laid out the strategy. He wanted to humiliate Mr. Reed in front of a judge and force Barbara to walk away with a fraction of what she demanded while paying alimony for the damage she had caused our family. He stepped closer to me, and his voice softened from the tone of a fierce litigator to the tone of a deeply concerned friend. He placed a hand on my shoulder and begged me to fight for my son. He reminded me of the terrifying night we spent waiting in the hospital when Eric had his accident and how I promised to always protect him. He warned me that if I surrendered the primary estate and the holding company, I would be leaving myself and my son completely vulnerable to the unpredictable nature of the economy. He pleaded with me not to let a vain, greedy woman and a loudmouth attorney bully me into financial ruin. He asked me to think about the legacy of Midwest Horizon and the thousands of grueling hours I spent pouring concrete and reading blueprints while Barbara was out spending my money at high-end boutiques. He told me that rolling over and giving her everything would be a permanent stain on my pride and a devastating blow to the future security that Eric so desperately needed. He begged me to just say the word so he could declare absolute war. I listened to my trusted friend pour his heart out in that small private room. I appreciated his brilliant legal strategy and his fierce loyalty to my family. He was entirely correct in his assessment of the law, and if this were a normal situation, I would have let him destroy Mr. Reed in court. but I knew something that neither my lawyer nor my wife could possibly comprehend. I slowly walked over to the glass table and picked up his yellow legal pad. I looked him dead in the eye and told him that a public trial would drag on for 2 or 3 years through endless discovery phases and appeals. I explained that a prolonged legal battle would freeze the holding company accounts and put my entire operation under a microscope. I needed this divorce finalized and the assets completely transferred within the next 30 days, and a trial would ruin that timeline. I placed the legal pad back on the table and patted his shoulder. I told him I was not acting out of fear or weakness. I instructed him to go back into the conference room and tell them I accept every single one of their demands. I opened the heavy oak door and stepped back into the sprawling conference room. The atmosphere inside had grown incredibly tense during our brief absence. Barbara was casually scrolling through her phone with a look of absolute boredom on her face. Mr. Reed was tapping his expensive gold pen against the polished mahogany table, and he let out a loud dramatic sigh the moment we walked in. He clearly expected us to return with a desperate counteroffer or a plea for mercy. My own attorney walked slowly behind me, and he looked physically ill. Mr. Foster sank into his chair like a man who had just been forced to watch his life work burn to the ground. He refused to make eye contact with the opposing counsel because he simply could not stomach the instructions I had just given him. I did not sit down immediately. I remained standing at the head of the table. I looked directly at the woman I had spent 4 decades building an empire for. She finally looked up from her phone and gave me a patronizing smile, assuming my lawyer had just explained how utterly trapped I was. She was waiting for me to beg. I placed my hands flat against the cool wood of the table and leaned forward just slightly. The room fell perfectly silent. I looked at the aggressive divorce lawyer and then shifted my gaze to my wife. I took a slow and steady breath before I spoke the words that completely shattered the tension in the room. I said very clearly and without a single trace of emotion to just give it all to her. The reaction was instantaneous and profound. Mr. Reed actually dropped his gold pen. It clattered loudly against the table, rolling away as his smug smirk vanished into a mask of pure shock. He had spent his entire career fighting brutal legal wars over fractions of a percent, and he could not process an unconditional surrender of this magnitude. Barbara blinked rapidly, and her confident posture faltered for a fraction of a second. She turned her head to look at her attorney, seeking confirmation that she had heard me correctly. When she saw the genuine surprise on his face, her initial confusion quickly morphed into an expression of immense and unadulterated greedy joy. She thought she had completely broken my spirit. To ensure there was absolutely no misunderstanding, I began to list the assets out loud. My voice was steady and even as I officially waived all claims to the primary estate. I told her she could have the sprawling mansion in the suburbs, along with every piece of custom furniture and artwork inside it. I stated that I would surrender the titles and the keys to the entire luxury car collection by the end of the week. That included the vintage classic cars I had spent countless weekends restoring with my own hands. Then I moved on to the crown jewel of the divorce. I formally relinquished 100% of my ownership stake in Midwest Horizon. I told them I would transfer my entire interest in the commercial real estate holding company directly into her name. I was handing over decades of sweat and sacrifice across a conference room table in a matter of seconds. Mr. Foster buried his face in his hands, unable to watch the slaughter. He believed I was throwing away my entire legacy out of exhaustion and despair. A predator like Mr. Reed does not simply accept a massive victory without looking for the hidden snare. He quickly regained his composure and leaned forward, narrowing his eyes at me. He demanded to know what the catch was. He asked my attorney if we were attempting some kind of elaborate tax evasion scheme or hiding assets in offshore accounts. Mr. Foster simply shook his head and remained entirely silent, unable to defend a strategy he vehemently opposed. The opposing lawyer then turned his aggressive focus back to me. He asked in a condescending tone if I was of sound mind, or if the stress of my son's recent accident had impaired my judgment. He actually warned me that he would have a physician evaluate my mental capacity if I tried to walk back this verbal agreement tomorrow morning. I looked at him with absolute clarity and assured him I was completely lucid. I stated that I fully understood the gravity of my actions and the exact value of the assets I was signing away. I told him I just wanted to be done with this marriage immediately. Barbara could not contain her excitement any longer. She let out a loud, triumphant laugh that echoed harshly off the glass walls of the conference room. She looked at me with an expression of pure pity mingled with disgust. She actually thanked me for finally being reasonable and accepting my defeat gracefully. She told me it was the smartest decision I had ever made because an old tired man like me would never have survived a brutal public trial. She began whispering excitedly to her lawyer about how quickly they could draft the final transfer documents. She was completely intoxicated by the idea of sudden massive wealth and total independence. She believed she had outsmarted me and conquered the empire. I simply watched her celebrate her hollow victory. I felt no anger and no sorrow. As she reveled in her greed, she was completely blinding herself to the reality of the business world. She was so focused on grabbing the keys to the kingdom that she was never going to bother inspecting the castle walls. The stage was now perfectly set for the one specific condition I needed to finalize my plan. The silence in the room was completely shattered by her laughter. It was a loud and grating sound that bounced off the thick glass walls. She leaned back in her expensive leather chair and crossed her arms, looking at me like a hunter looking at a discarded carcass. She did not just want to take my wealth, she wanted to take my absolute dignity. She spoke to her lawyer, but kept her eyes locked entirely on me, saying she always knew I would eventually fold. She called me a tired old man who simply lacked the stamina to fight a real war anymore. She told the room that my best years were buried under the concrete of my construction sites, and that I no longer had the fire required to protect my own kingdom. Her words were specifically designed to humiliate me in front of the legal counsel to make me feel small and powerless. I just watched her painted lips move while she celebrated a victory that would soon destroy her completely. She leaned forward and rested her elbows on the polished mahogany table, wanting to get closer to deliver her insults. She spoke directly to me now, and her voice was dripping with venom and condescension. She said I looked absolutely exhausted, just sitting there across from her. She mocked my prolonged silence, calling it a pathetic display of emotional weakness. She proudly compared me to the young venture capitalist she was leaving me for, making sure every word stung. She bragged about his boundless energy and his modern approach to business, claiming that my era of slow and steady labor was completely dead and irrelevant. She told me I should be grateful she was taking the heavy burden of the company off my shaking shoulders so I could finally retire to a quiet corner and wither away in peace. She painted a vivid picture of her glamorous new life traveling the world on the massive profits of Midwest Horizon, while I stayed behind to rot in obscurity. She was utterly convinced that my advancing age had stripped me of my intellect and my courage. Then she slammed her manicured hand flat on the table to issue her ultimate command. She looked at Mr. Foster and stated that she wanted this entire process finished immediately, without any delays. She demanded that every single title deed and corporate registration be transferred exclusively into her name within exactly 30 days. She insisted she would not wait a single moment longer to assume total control of the massive assets. Mr. Reed attempted to calm her down by whispering nervously that commercial transfers of this magnitude usually take several months to untangle safely. But Barbara snapped at her own lawyer, demanding he do his job and forced the expedited timeline, no matter what it took. She turned back to me and declared that I had 30 days to pack my personal belongings and vacate the primary estate for good. She wanted me out of her house before the end of the month, so she could begin renovating the sprawling property with her new partner. She believed the tight deadline was her ultimate power play to leave me scrambling and destitute. She was so incredibly consumed by her own toxic arrogance that she completely failed to see the mortal danger staring her in the face. Any reasonable person acquiring a massive commercial real estate empire would demand a rigorous forensic audit immediately. A smart and capable investor would beg for 90 days of extensive financial discovery to examine the corporate ledgers and understand the hidden liabilities attached to the buildings. But Barbara did not care about the ledgers or the balance sheets. She only cared about the optics and the immediate gratification of holding supreme wealth. She saw the gross valuation of the company printed on a piece of paper, and her mind went entirely blank to anything else. She wanted the keys to the castle before the end of the current month, and she was willing to bulldoze through every standard legal precaution to get them. She assumed she was putting a loaded gun to my head by forcing a rapid, unexamined transfer. She was too blinded by her own vanity to realize I was gladly handing her a ticking time bomb. Mr. Foster looked at me with wild panic in his eyes, hoping I would forcefully push back against the absurd 30-day timeline. He knew the sheer volume of complex paperwork required and felt the deadline was deeply insulting to everything we had built. But I did not flinch or raise my voice. I kept my hands folded neatly on my lap and looked directly into my wife's glowing and arrogant eyes. I told her in a perfectly calm and measured voice that 30 days would not be a problem at all. I agreed to quietly vacate the mansion and surrender the entire car collection by her exact deadline. I promised her that Midwest Horizon would be entirely hers before the month was officially over. Her smile widened into a terrifying mask of pure, selfish triumph. She truly believed she had beaten me into absolute and humiliating submission. She thought my quick agreement was the final pathetic whimper of a broken man giving up on life. She had no idea that her aggressive demand for a rapid 30-day transfer fit perfectly into the 45-day balloon mortgage trap I had secretly laid for her. I let her gloat for another moment before I raised my hand just slightly to command the room. I told her that I would gladly meet her 30-day deadline, but it required one very specific and entirely non-negotiable compromise. I kept my voice incredibly soft and steady, making sure not to sound eager or defensive. I explained that stripping a massive commercial entity like Midwest Horizon down to its bare studs and transferring the sheer volume of corporate registrations normally takes a quarter of a year to execute safely. I told them that to move at the breakneck speed, she demanded we could not afford the standard corporate delays or the usual banking reviews. I looked directly at her attorney and stated that my wife must agree to absorb the holding company exactly as is without any reservations. That meant taking immediate and total ownership of all attached institutional bank accounts, active ledgers, and existing corporate structures without a single alteration or delay from my side of the table. I leaned back in my chair and laid out the bait with absolute precision, knowing she would swallow it whole. I explained that performing a standard forensic audit of the company would trigger a mandatory 90-day freeze on all major asset transfers and commercial operations. I told her that if she wanted the keys to the empire by the end of the month, she would have to formally waive her legal right to that financial discovery period. I framed the proposal beautifully, making it sound as though I was the one making a reluctant and painful sacrifice. I acted as if handing over the unexamined corporate accounts was a reckless move on my part that would leave my own personal investments slightly disorganized and vulnerable. I painted the waiver as a necessary administrative shortcut to satisfy her aggressive and impatient demands. I knew that wrapping the trap in a heavy layer of bureaucratic urgency would be the perfect way to bypass any lingering suspicions she or her legal counsel might have. Mr. Reed immediately shifted in his expensive leather chair, and his predatory instincts flared up right on cue. He was an aggressive and often theatrical divorce attorney, but he was not a fool when it came to corporate liability and asset protection. He held up a hand and strongly advised his client against waiving the forensic audit under any circumstances. He warned Barbara that taking a commercial real estate firm as is without a thorough investigation into the holding accounts was an incredibly dangerous legal maneuver that could expose her to unknown risks. He insisted they needed at least 60 days to bring in outside accountants to verify the liquidity and carefully inspect the institutional ledgers. My own lawyer, Mr. Foster, watched the exchange with utter bewilderment and growing concern. He remained completely silent, but his eyes darted nervously between me and the opposing counsel, trying to understand my endgame. I simply sat there looking like a defeated old man who just wanted to sign the papers and go home to sleep. I let my shoulders slump forward slightly to perfectly sell the illusion of my total and absolute surrender. Barbara snapped her head toward her lawyer and completely dismissed his professional warning with a careless wave of her manicured hand. Her mind was entirely consumed by the massive gross valuation numbers she had seen on the preliminary tax documents and the dazzling promise of instant wealth. She was absolutely blinded by the toxic combination of extreme greed and her burning desire to secure a rapid, humiliating victory over me. She looked at me with deep suspicion, but her suspicion was entirely misplaced and directed at the wrong details. She actually accused me of trying to stall the transfer with unnecessary accounting protocols so I could secretly siphon cash out of the corporate accounts before she took official control. She arrogantly told Mr. Reed that she refused to give me 90 days to hide her money in shadow accounts. She was so fiercely convinced of her own superior intellect that she completely ignored the massive legal risk she was eagerly volunteering to take. Her blinding overconfidence was the exact weakness I had counted on from the very beginning of this nightmare. She demanded that her lawyer draft the waiver immediately and add it to the final mediation agreement without any further discussion. Mr. Reed protested one last time, citing his ethical obligation to protect her financial interests, but she loudly ordered him to do his job and print the paperwork. Within minutes, the hastily typed addendum was placed on the center of the polished mahogany table right between us. It explicitly stated that Barbara was accepting Midwest Horizon and all attached institutional accounts exactly as they currently stood, entirely waiving her right to any financial discovery or forensic audit to speed up the settlement process. She snatched the heavy gold pen from her attorney and quickly signed her name across the bottom of the page with a dramatic and victorious flourish. She pushed the document across the table toward me with a triumphant smirk, expecting me to feel the crushing weight of my final loss. I picked up my own pen and slowly signed my name next to hers, sealing the legally binding agreement. She thought she had just conquered a glorious empire, but she had just signed her own financial death warrant. I walked out of the law office and stepped into the cool afternoon air of the city. The heavy glass doors closed behind me, sealing the fate of the woman who had just signed her own ruin. She was still sitting in that conference room celebrating a magnificent victory that did not actually exist. She believed she had stripped me of my legacy and left me to fade away into obscurity. But as I walked down the busy sidewalk toward my car, my mind drifted back to a cold morning, exactly 6 months ago. That was the exact moment this entire sequence of events had truly been set into motion. It was a quiet Tuesday, and I was sitting alone in my home office reviewing the quarterly bank statements for our personal accounts. I had always trusted her with the domestic finances, assuming we were partners building a life together. I had never felt the need to micromanage the money she spent on her daily life. But that morning I noticed a pattern of massive unexplained withdrawals that completely shattered the illusion of my marriage. I spent hours tracing the missing money through a maze of offshore transfers and hidden personal accounts she had quietly established. She had been siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars out of our shared reserves for over a year. She was deliberately bleeding our liquid cash dry while maintaining the perfect facade of a loyal wife. I dug deeper and uncovered the trail of expensive gifts, luxury hotel bookings, and private flights she had purchased for her new, younger investor. I realized with absolute clarity that she was not just having an affair. She was meticulously preparing to leave me, and she was systematically moving our cash out of my reach before she dropped the divorce papers on the kitchen counter. She wanted to drain the liquid assets first, and then use the legal system to seize the massive physical properties and the corporate holding company. She was planning to gut me entirely and leave me scrambling to care for our disabled son with nothing but empty bank accounts. A lesser man would have confronted her immediately, a man driven by pride and ego would have thrown the bank statements in her face and demanded an explanation. He would have screamed and shouted and filed for divorce the very next day. But I did not build a commercial real estate empire by reacting with raw emotion. When you discover that a partner is trying to destroy you from the inside, you do not alert them to the fact that they have been caught. You quietly secure your own defenses, and you lay a trap they cannot possibly escape. I placed the bank statements back in the drawer exactly where I had found them. I walked out of my office and smiled at her when she came home that evening. I asked her about her day and listened to her tell elaborate lies without changing my expression. Behind my calm and supportive exterior, my mind was already dissecting the legal architecture of my entire corporate empire. I began looking for the exact mechanism I could use to turn her greed into a weapon against her. The solution I found was a masterpiece of commercial finance. As the sole operating director of Midwest Horizon, I possessed total authority over the corporate ledger. The company held a massive portfolio of prime real estate in the city, and my personal credit was absolutely pristine. Our physical assets were completely paid off and free of any financial encumbrances. Barbara looked at those assets and saw a mountain of solid gold. I looked at them and saw the perfect collateral. Without breathing a single word to my wife, I initiated a series of high-level meetings with several private institutional lenders. I told the banks that I was preparing for a massive, aggressive expansion of my commercial portfolio. I leveraged the entire gross value of the holding company to secure a series of enormous commercial loans. I legally borrowed tens of millions of dollars against the physical properties, the corporate name, and the future revenues of the business. I tied the massive debt directly to the legal entity of Midwest Horizon. I did not stop with the commercial real estate company. I needed to ensure that every single asset she coveted was completely loaded with crippling liability. I moved quietly to leverage the primary suburban estate and the luxury car collection. I took out massive multi-million-dollar mortgages against the sprawling mansion she loved so much. I used the vintage automobiles as collateral for high-interest personal loans. Every single physical item she planned to demand in the divorce was secretly transformed into a massive financial anchor. The brilliance of the strategy was that it was all entirely legal and strictly documented. I was simply an ambitious businessman leveraging his current holdings to generate liquid capital for future investments. The banks were more than happy to hand over the cash because the gross value of my empire was so incredibly high. They wired millions of dollars into completely separate, isolated corporate accounts that I had established strictly under my own name. I was draining the actual value out of the empire while leaving the shiny physical shell perfectly intact for her to claim. By the time she finally dropped those divorce papers on the kitchen island 6 months later, the trap had already been set and fully armed. The magnificent properties, the towering commercial buildings, and the pristine luxury cars were completely hollowed out from the inside. She demanded 100% ownership of the physical assets because she assumed they were totally free and clear of any debt. She thought she was legally seizing an untouchable fortune that would fund her glamorous new life forever. She had absolutely no idea that she was fighting tooth and nail to take ownership of a staggering mountain of institutional debt. When she aggressively signed the waiver in the mediation room, refusing the forensic audit, she willingly blinded herself to the reality of the corporate ledgers. She eagerly chained herself to the massive loans I had quietly secured. I had managed to extract all the real wealth from the estate and hide it safely away, while she practically begged the lawyers to hand her the empty mortgaged shell. She truly believed she had taken everything from me, but she had only taken the magnificent poison I prepared for her. I had successfully extracted tens of millions of dollars in liquid cash from the hollowed-out shell of my real estate empire. The money was sitting safely in temporary holding accounts, but I knew it could not stay there for long. If the cash remained attached to my personal name or any standard corporate entity, Barbara and her aggressive legal team would eventually hunt it down and seize it. They would demand their unfair share of the liquid assets during the ruthless divorce proceedings, claiming they were entitled to the fruits of my labor. I needed to move that towering mountain of capital into a legal fortress that was completely impenetrable. My primary motivation was never about maintaining my own personal wealth or living a life of luxury after the divorce was finalized. My singular focus was the absolute protection and survival of my son. Eric was trapped in a broken body, requiring a lifetime of incredibly expensive, specialized care. I was going to use the exact fortune his mother wanted to steal to guarantee he would never suffer for a single second of his remaining life. I met with a highly specialized team of estate planners and medical trust attorneys well outside the city limits to ensure total secrecy. I instructed them to draft the most aggressive and bulletproof legal vehicle available under modern financial law. We created a specialized, irrevocable medical trust, housed entirely within a newly formed separate legal entity. The specific structure of this unique trust meant that the very moment the funds were transferred inside the money immediately ceased to be my personal property. It ceased to be a marital asset that could ever be divided in a greedy divorce court. The legal entity existed in an entirely different financial universe, completely severed from the toxic battleground of my ruined marriage. It was a standalone fortress with one singular, unbreakable mandate written directly into its founding charter. Every single penny held within its thick legal walls was to be used exclusively for the lifelong medical care, rehabilitation, and physical comfort of my son. Pushing the button to transfer those tens of millions of dollars into the irrevocable trust was the easiest and most liberating decision I have ever made in my entire life. By legally surrendering my own ownership of the capital, I successfully built the ultimate unbreachable firewall against my treacherous wife. Barbara could hire an army of the most vicious divorce attorneys in the entire country, and they would simply hit a solid brick wall. They could not attach the trust in the mediation room because the money simply did not belong to me anymore. It belonged to an independent fiduciary board strictly legally bound to protect Eric from any outside interference. I willingly stripped myself of my own liquid fortune just to ensure she could never sink her greedy manicured claws into it. I transformed the vulnerable cash into an armored shield around my helpless boy. I knew that while she was busy measuring the square footage of the empty mansion, I was quietly buying my son a lifetime of absolute medical security. The sheer staggering volume of cash funneled into that trust meant that Eric would always have access to the highest tier of medical support the world had to offer. The funds were permanently locked away to cover round-the-clock private nursing staff for the rest of his natural life without ever worrying about the cost. It guaranteed his ongoing access to the most advanced experimental physical therapies, cutting-edge neurological treatments, and top-tier mobility equipment. The trust was perfectly structured to purchase and fully retrofit any future property he might need, ensuring he would always live in total comfort and undisturbed dignity. Barbara had cruelly called our son a bottomless money pit because she utterly despised the financial drain of his slow recovery. I took the entire financial lifeblood of the empire she coveted so deeply and dumped it straight into that exact pit. I made absolutely sure that my son would never be considered a financial burden to anyone ever again. The sheer legal brilliance of the irrevocable transfer lay in the terrible optics it would create for anyone foolish enough to challenge it in a public courtroom. I had executed the massive transfer of funds several months before Barbara ever dropped those divorce papers on the kitchen island. I moved the money completely legally as a concerned, loving father providing for the catastrophic medical needs of his severely disabled child. Even if her predatory lawyer eventually traced the missing liquidity, he would face an absolute legal and public relations nightmare. To claw that money back into the marital estate, Barbara would literally have to file a massive aggressive lawsuit against her own paralyzed son. She would have to stand in front of a stern judge and publicly argue that she deserved to strip away her child's critical medical life support just to fund her luxury shopping habits. I knew her paralyzing vanity and obsession with high society optics would never allow her to survive that kind of devastating public exposure. The money was permanently out of her reach. I vividly remember returning to the guest house the quiet evening. The final massive wire transfer officially cleared the bank. I walked into the sterile room and stood beside the heavy medical bed, listening to the soft, rhythmic hum of the oxygen concentrator. I watched Eric sleep peacefully, completely unaware of the vicious legal war raging just across the manicured lawn. A profound and unshakable sense of deep peace washed over my tired shoulders, replacing all the stress of the past few months. I had officially lost my sprawling suburban estate, my beautiful luxury cars, and my famous corporate title, but I had never felt more incredibly victorious. I had successfully outsmarted a greedy, selfish parasite and secured the survival of the only person in the world who truly mattered to me. I looked out the window toward the main house where Barbara was busy packing her designer bags and counting her imaginary riches. I smiled in the quiet darkness, knowing I had already won the most important battle of my life. The architecture of a standard residential loan is designed for long-term stability. Average people take 30 years to slowly chip away at the principal balance of their homes. They make steady, predictable monthly payments that eventually lead to total ownership. But the financial instruments I utilized to drain the equity from my empire were entirely different beasts. I did not use traditional mortgages. I deliberately selected a series of aggressive commercial bridge loans featuring what the banking industry calls a balloon payment structure. These specific contracts are incredibly predatory if mismanaged. They offer deceptively low interest-only payments for a very brief introductory window. However, the true danger lies at the absolute end of that short-term period. At the very moment the introductory window closes, the borrower is legally obligated to pay back the entire massive principal amount in one single terrifying lump sum. It is a financial instrument built strictly for rapid commercial development and quick liquidations. It was never meant to be held by an ignorant and arrogant woman trying to fund a glamorous retirement. The sheer scale of the leverage I attached to the physical assets was staggering. I had successfully encumbered the main suburban estate, the entire fleet of luxury automobiles, and the commercial holding company with a combined liability of $12 million. Every single one of those commercial bridge loans carried the exact same aggressively short maturity date. I had perfectly timed the banking contracts to coincide with the anticipated finalization of our brutal divorce proceedings. The paperwork dictated that the massive $12 million balloon repayment would trigger exactly 45 days after the judge struck his gavel and finalized the asset transfer. A normal business operator would have secured long-term refinancing well in advance. But I had deliberately left the debt exposed and highly volatile. From the moment Barbara proudly signed her name on the final divorce decree, an invisible and unstoppable clock would immediately begin counting down. She would have exactly 1 month and a half to come up with $12 million in liquid cash. The most beautiful aspect of this lethal trap was her complete and utter ignorance of its existence. Barbara only understood wealth in its most superficial physical forms. When she walked through the sprawling mansion, she only saw the imported marble floors and the sparkling crystal chandeliers. She never once considered the crushing financial liability hiding just behind the freshly painted drywall. She looked at the vintage cars sitting in the climate-controlled garage and imagined the envious stares of her high society friends. She never bothered to look for a bank lien or a title loan registration. By aggressively forcing her own lawyer to waive the mandatory 90-day forensic audit, she actively blindfolded herself before walking onto a live minefield. She accepted the company and the properties exactly as they stood, completely shielding me from any future allegations of fraud or financial misrepresentation. She practically begged to take on the immediate legal liability because she was too greedy to wait for a proper accounting review. Even if by some absolute miracle, her aggressive divorce attorney managed to discover the hidden balloon mortgages after the transfer was complete, she was already entirely doomed. Uncovering the debt would not save her because she possessed absolutely no mechanism to pay it off. The towering mountain of liquid cash that could have easily neutralized the $12 million balloon payment was permanently gone. I had safely locked every available penny inside the irrevocable medical trust for Eric. She was about to become the sole legal owner of a massive fleet of sinking ships, and she did not have a single life vest or a drop of liquid capital to keep herself afloat. Her younger and supposedly wealthier venture capitalist boyfriend certainly did not have $12 million in liquid cash lying around to bail out a foolish older woman. She had isolated herself on an island of toxic debt and severed all ties to the only man who knew how to navigate those treacherous financial waters. I knew exactly what would transpire the moment the sun rose on day 46. Commercial lenders are not forgiving entities driven by emotion or pity. They are cold, calculating institutions that operate strictly on contractual obligations and missed deadlines. The very second the massive balloon payment defaulted, the banks would initiate immediate and ruthless foreclosure proceedings across the entire board. They would instantly freeze the operational accounts of Midwest Horizon, completely paralyzing the commercial holding company. A fleet of tow trucks would arrive at the suburban estate in broad daylight to repossess the luxury car collection right out of her driveway. The primary mansion itself would be seized and auctioned off to recover the remaining institutional debt. The financial execution would be swift, brutal, and entirely merciless. She would watch the empire she sacrificed her marriage to steal dissolve into absolute dust right in front of her panicked eyes. Knowing the precise date of her inevitable financial annihilation brought me a profound and quiet sense of peace. I did not need to scream or argue with her in the mediation room because the banks were going to do all the screaming for me. I could simply sit back and let the relentless passage of time execute my perfect revenge. Every day she spent shopping for new designer clothes or planning expensive renovations for the mansion was just another tick of the invisible clock counting down to her total destruction. She had spent the last several months treating our disabled son like a burden and mocking my decades of grueling labor. She demanded the crown without understanding the terrible weight of the kingdom. I gladly gave her the heavy crown she asked for. I gave her the keys to the entire empire. But I engineered that empire to collapse directly on top of her in exactly 45 days, leaving her with absolutely nothing but dust and regret. I packed my personal belongings into a few simple cardboard boxes and quietly vacated the sprawling suburban estate well before the 30-day deadline expired. I did not hire a massive fleet of professional movers or make a dramatic exit. I simply loaded my clothes and my son's specialized medical equipment into a rented transport van and drove away from the opulent mansion I had built from the ground up. I relocated us to a very modest 2-bedroom rental apartment located in a quiet, working-class neighborhood on the edge of the city. To the outside observer, it looked like the absolute and tragic downfall of a once powerful corporate titan. It appeared as though a bitter divorce had completely stripped me of my wealth and forced an exhausted old man into a life of quiet desperation and financial ruin. My former colleagues and distant relatives whispered about my supposed collapse, assuming I was barely scraping by on a meager retirement fund. The new apartment was entirely unremarkable from the outside, featuring faded brick walls and a small concrete patio that overlooked a busy suburban street. The kitchen had outdated appliances, and the living room was barely large enough to hold a sofa and a small television. It was the exact opposite of the towering glass windows and imported marble floors Barbara was currently celebrating in the main estate. But the modest exterior was absolutely the perfect camouflage for my master plan. I wanted everyone in the city to believe I had been thoroughly defeated and banished to the shadows of the real estate market. Living in a plain, unpretentious building shielded me from any lingering scrutiny and allowed me to focus entirely on my son. I did not miss the sprawling, manicured lawns or the climate-controlled garages for a single second. The tight walls of the small rental felt incredibly warm and safe, completely free from the toxic vanity and relentless greed that had infected my former home. While the living room and kitchen looked perfectly suited for a bankrupt old man, the second bedroom told an entirely different story. That room was completely transformed into a state-of-the-art medical sanctuary, funded entirely by the invisible and bulletproof irrevocable trust. Behind the cheap wooden door of the rental apartment, Eric was receiving the absolute highest tier of specialized care available in the modern medical world. The trust seamlessly covered the massive weekly invoices for his elite private nursing staff, cutting-edge physical therapy equipment, and advanced neurological treatments. The neighbors in our modest building simply thought I was a dedicated father, struggling to care for a disabled child on a fixed income. They had absolutely no idea that millions of dollars were quietly working in the background to guarantee my son experienced total comfort and dignity. I slept soundly on a cheap mattress in the adjacent room, experiencing a profound level of peace I had never felt in the mansion. It was a mild Tuesday afternoon, and I was pushing Eric in his customized mobility chair down the narrow suburban sidewalk to enjoy the fresh air. We were simply taking a quiet stroll under the shade of the large oak trees that lined our average neighborhood street. Suddenly, the peaceful atmosphere was shattered by the aggressive roar of a massive engine. A gleaming black luxury sport utility vehicle turned the corner and slowed down as it approached us. It was one of the flagship vehicles from the premium car collection I had surrendered in the divorce settlement. The heavy tinted windows glided down smoothly to reveal Barbara sitting behind the leather-wrapped steering wheel. She was wearing massive designer sunglasses and a smug expression that radiated pure, toxic arrogance. She had deliberately gone entirely out of her way to drive through my humble new neighborhood, just to inspect my supposed misery and validate her own hollow victory. She slowed the massive luxury vehicle to a crawl and pulled up right alongside the curb where Eric and I were resting. She lowered her sunglasses to the bridge of her nose and let her eyes slowly scan the faded brick facade of my modest rental building. She let out a loud theatrical sigh of fake pity and shook her head in mock sympathy. She spoke to me with a dripping, condescending tone, noting how incredibly far I had fallen from my glorious corporate heights. She gestured toward the small concrete patio and loudly wondered how a man who used to own the city skyline could tolerate rotting away in such a depressing and cramped little box. She did not even bother to look at our son sitting quietly in his wheelchair. Her entire focus was locked on humiliating me and celebrating the massive difference between her stolen luxury and my fabricated poverty. She wanted me to feel the crushing weight of regret and beg her for a scrap of mercy. I did not raise my voice or offer a single word of defense regarding my new living situation. I stood on the cracked concrete sidewalk and looked at the shiny chrome grille of her expensive vehicle. I knew with absolute certainty that the aggressive balloon loan attached to that very car was scheduled to default in exactly 14 days. I knew the repo men were already finalizing the paperwork to drag that beautiful machine right out of her manicured driveway. I looked up at the woman who had traded her family for a mountain of toxic debt, and I simply smiled. It was not a bitter or sarcastic smile, but a genuine expression of deep, absolute tranquility. I told her in a soft and steady voice that she did not need to worry about me because I currently had everything I could ever possibly need. My genuine contentment completely unsettled her. She scoffed loudly, rolled the tinted window back up, and sped away in a cloud of exhaust, firmly believing she had won the war. She drove off to enjoy her final 2 weeks of imaginary wealth, while I turned the wheelchair around and walked my safely protected son back to our peaceful home. The days following our brief encounter on the sidewalk settled into a quiet and predictable rhythm. I spent my mornings assisting the private nurses with my son and my afternoons reading books in the small concrete courtyard. It was a simple existence, completely devoid of the chaotic noise that used to fill my days in the corporate boardroom. I no longer had to answer frantic calls from demanding investors or manage the endless stream of contractors building the city skyline. I was finally allowed to just breathe. But across the city, I knew my former wife was living at an entirely different velocity. She was frantically rushing from one luxury boutique to another, spending money she falsely believed she possessed in limitless quantities. She was hosting lavish dinner parties in the mansion, trying desperately to impress her new circle of elite friends and her younger venture capitalist partner. Her entire reality was spinning out of control, fueled by an illusion of absolute financial dominance. It was late on a Thursday evening when the silence of my modest apartment was broken by the sharp buzzing of my cellular phone sitting on the kitchen counter. I walked over and picked up the device, seeing her name flash across the bright screen. It was a text message deliberately timed to arrive late at night to maximize its psychological impact. I opened the message and read the hateful words she had carefully typed out. She did not bother with any formal greetings. She simply stated that she was officially removing me from the premium corporate health insurance policy attached to Midwest Horizon at the end of the current billing cycle. She typed that since I was no longer contributing anything of value to the company or society, she saw no reason why her successful business should subsidize the medical care of a broken old man. She added a cruel final sentence suggesting I start looking for a free public clinic because my days of premium health care were permanently over. An ordinary man might have panicked reading a message like that. A man who had truly lost everything might have felt a crushing wave of despair or immediately called his lawyer begging for a legal injunction to preserve his medical coverage. But I simply stood in the dim light of my small kitchen and read the venomous words with a feeling of profound amusement. She was trying so desperately to exert total dominance over my daily life, reaching out from her mansion, just to twist the knife she thought she had buried in my back. She wanted to picture me sitting in the dark, terrified of falling ill, and unable to afford basic medication. She wanted me to feel the bitter sting of total abandonment. I did not reply to her cruel message. I did not send back a single angry word or a plea for mercy. I simply pressed a button on the screen and quietly archived the text message, saving it as a perfect digital monument to her absolute supreme arrogance. The sheer comedy of her specific threat was almost too perfectly ironic to fully comprehend. She honestly believed she was cutting off my lifeline and leaving me physically vulnerable to the harsh realities of old age. She was entirely unaware that months before she even handed me the divorce papers, I had already secured premium lifetime medical coverage for myself using a tiny fraction of the liquid capital I had extracted from the empire. More importantly, her threat to our medical security was completely toothless, because the massive, irrevocable trust I had built for Eric covered absolutely every single aspect of his healthcare independently. She was threatening to lock a door without realizing I had already walked out of the building and taken the entire vault with me. She was wasting her time trying to starve a man who had already secured a lifetime supply of provisions. Her petty attempt at financial blackmail was completely useless and only served to highlight the depth of her wicked and vindictive nature. Every single arrogant move she made during that final month only sweetened the lethal trap I had so carefully constructed. I learned from mutual acquaintances that she was publicly bragging at country club luncheons about how thoroughly she had decimated me in the mediation room. She was proudly telling anyone who would listen that she had outsmarted a titan of the real estate industry and seized his entire kingdom without shedding a single drop of sweat. She was eagerly parading her young venture capitalist boyfriend around the city, treating him to expensive gifts paid for by the very company she was currently driving into the ground. She felt absolutely invincible sitting on her throne of mortgaged bricks and leveraged steel. She was moving through the world with the reckless confidence of a woman who genuinely believed she had conquered the entire universe. She had no idea she was joyfully dancing right on the edge of a massive bottomless crater. I placed my phone back on the counter and looked at the calendar hanging on the kitchen wall. The invisible countdown clock was steadily ticking away in the background. There were exactly 5 days left until the massive $12 million balloon payment officially defaulted. 5 days until the commercial lenders woke up and realized the newly crowned queen of Midwest Horizon did not possess a single liquid penny to satisfy the massive institutional debt. I walked down the short hallway and peeked into the second bedroom to check on my son one last time before going to sleep. The private nurse nodded to me, indicating that his vitals were perfectly stable and he was resting comfortably. I walked into my own small bedroom and lay down on the simple mattress, pulling the thin blanket up to my chest. I closed my eyes and let out a long, slow breath, feeling an incredible sense of deep anticipation. The trap was fully primed, and the impending explosion was going to be absolutely spectacular. The heavy wooden doors of the downtown courthouse swung shut behind us, sealing us inside a room that felt more like a tomb than a hall of justice. The air was incredibly stale and thick with the smell of old paper and the lingering tension of 1,000 broken families. I walked down the center aisle with slow and deliberate steps, wearing a simple gray suit that I had pulled from one of my cardboard boxes that morning. I did not look like a corporate titan preparing to surrender a massive real estate empire. I looked exactly like the broken and defeated old man my wife desperately needed me to be. Mr. Foster walked closely beside me, clutching his leather briefcase as if it were a physical shield. His shoulders were visibly slumped, and his face was drawn tight with professional agony. He had spent the entire car ride to the courthouse begging me one last time to halt the proceedings and demand a proper forensic audit. I had simply looked out the window and told him that the train had already left the station and we were just here to watch the crash. Barbara was already seated at the opposing table when we arrived. She looked absolutely radiant and was practically glowing with the toxic energy of her impending victory. She had worn a vibrant crimson dress specifically chosen to stand out against the dull, muted tones of the legal environment. It was a visual declaration of her total dominance. Her aggressive attorney, Mr. Reed, leaned back in his chair with his legs crossed, looking like a man who had just pulled off the heist of the century without breaking a single sweat. He offered my lawyer a patronizing nod, completely relishing the fact that he was about to secure a massive fortune for his client without ever having to argue a single motion. Barbara did not even bother to look in my direction. She was entirely focused on the thick stack of transfer documents sitting perfectly aligned on the table, treating them as if they were a stack of winning lottery tickets, just waiting to be cashed. She tapped her manicured fingers impatiently against the wood, completely eager to finalize the absolute destruction of my legacy. The courtroom fell into a heavy and respectful silence as the judge entered and took his seat behind the elevated mahogany bench. He was an older man with silver hair and sharp, penetrating eyes that had spent decades parsing through the bitter lies and greedy demands of divorcing couples. He adjusted his glasses and spent a long, agonizing moment flipping through the incredibly thick settlement agreement we had submitted. The silence stretched on, filled only by the crisp sound of heavy paper turning. I watched the brow of the judge furrow deeper and deeper with every single page he reviewed. He was a seasoned legal professional, and he instantly recognized that this was not a standard division of marital assets. He was staring at a document where a man who had built a sprawling commercial empire was voluntarily walking away with nothing more than the clothes on his back and a modest pension. It defied all standard legal logic, and his sharp eyes immediately darted toward my table looking for any subtle signs of coercion, blackmail, or hidden duress. The judge finally lowered the document, took off his glasses, and looked directly at me. He completely ignored the posturing attorneys and addressed me with a voice that was both stern and deeply concerned. He stated for the official court record that the settlement agreement sitting in front of him was highly unusual and heavily lopsided. He read aloud the specific clauses where I officially surrendered the primary suburban estate, the entire luxury vehicle collection, and total ownership of Midwest Horizon. He then read the exact paragraph where my wife explicitly waived her right to any forensic audit or financial discovery regarding the corporate accounts. He leaned forward and asked me point blank if I fully understood the severe and permanent consequences of signing this specific decree. He wanted to make absolutely certain that I was not being threatened behind closed doors, reminding me that once the gavel fell, I would permanently forfeit my entire life work. Mr. Foster shifted nervously in his seat, holding his breath, and secretly praying that the harsh reality of the words from the judge would finally snap me out of my supposed depression. Across the aisle, Barbara completely stopped tapping her fingers. Her posture went totally rigid because she was terrified that the judge was going to accidentally wake me up and ruin her flawless victory. She glared at me silently, demanding that I stick to the script and surrender. I did not look at her at all. I stood up slowly, respectfully facing the bench, and buttoned my suit jacket. I met the sharp gaze of the judge with an expression of profound and absolute tranquility. My voice did not shake and my hands did not tremble. I spoke clearly and steadily into the silent courtroom. I told the judge that I was completely aware of the sheer magnitude of the assets being transferred. I stated for the official record that I was acting entirely of my own free will, without any coercion or hidden duress. I calmly confirmed that I fully understood I was walking away from the empire I had built, and I was entirely at peace with that decision. The judge searched my face for a long time, looking for a single trace of doubt or fear. He found absolutely nothing but cold, unbothered certainty. He let out a heavy sigh that was the sound of a man resigning himself to a decision he did not personally understand, but was legally bound to accept. He stated that it was not the job of the court to protect a man from his own voluntary financial decisions, provided he was of sound mind. He picked up his pen and began signing the final pages of the absolute decree. With every stroke of his pen, the smile on the face of Barbara grew wider and more predatory. She practically vibrated with excitement, watching the massive commercial empire officially cross over into her possession. She thought my calm demeanor was simply the pathetic resignation of a weak and exhausted old man who had finally surrendered to a superior opponent. She had absolutely no idea that I was perfectly calm, because I was standing at a completely safe distance, watching her enthusiastically tie the blindfold around her own eyes, right before walking off a massive financial cliff. The judge placed his heavy gold pen flat on the mahogany bench and let out a long breath that echoed in the silent room. He gathered the thick stack of settlement papers and squared the edges perfectly against the wood, confirming that every single page was properly signed and legally binding. He reached for the wooden gavel resting on the corner of his desk and lifted it high into the air. Time seemed to slow down completely in that exact fraction of a second. I watched the polished wood descend through the stale air of the courtroom with absolute clarity. The gavel struck the sound block with a sharp cracking noise that was incredibly loud and deeply final. It was the absolute sound of a 40-year marriage officially terminating, and the exact moment my trap locked firmly into place. The echo of the strike slowly faded away into the high ceilings, leaving behind a massive and permanent shift in the atmosphere of the room. The deed was finally done. In the eyes of the law and the state of Illinois, the staggering wealth of my entire life had just officially changed hands. The keys to the sprawling suburban estate, the titles to the vintage luxury cars, and the complete corporate ownership of Midwest Horizon now legally belonged solely to Barbara. The invisible but massive weight of the commercial real estate empire completely lifted off my tired shoulders and gently floated across the aisle, settling directly onto hers. She was now the supreme ruler of a kingdom she did not understand, and the sole owner of a financial disaster she could not possibly survive. I felt a sudden massive wave of pure elation wash through my blood, but I kept my hands folded neatly on my lap and maintained the posture of a defeated old man. I was absolutely free from the toxic debt and entirely liberated from the woman who had sought to destroy my son. The relief washing over my soul was sweeter than any corporate victory I had ever experienced. Barbara did not waste a single second attempting to show grace or humility in her overwhelming victory. She immediately pushed her heavy chair back, making a loud scraping noise against the floor tiles, and stood up to her full, elegant height. She reached down with her perfectly manicured hands and began smoothing out the invisible wrinkles in her vibrant crimson designer dress. Every single physical movement she made was deliberately exaggerated and carefully designed to draw the attention of the entire room directly to her. She wanted the judge and the lawyers to admire the confident posture of a woman who had just secured limitless independent wealth without lifting a finger. She adjusted the expensive silk scarf around her neck and lifted her chin, treating the drab legal courtroom as if it were her own private coronation ceremony. She was completely intoxicated by the blinding illusion of her sudden massive power and totally consumed by her own bottomless vanity. She looked like a queen who had just conquered the world. She slowly turned her head and looked directly across the aisle at me. She did not bother to hide the absolute triumphant malice radiating from her dark eyes. She stared at me with a potent mixture of deep pity and intense disgust, fully believing she was looking at a ruined and pathetic creature. She truly thought I was nothing more than an empty shell of a man who would spend his final years rotting away in a cheap rental apartment while struggling desperately to feed a severely disabled son. She wanted me to feel the crushing humiliation of my supposed failure and to beg silently for her forgiveness or her charity. I met her aggressive and arrogant gaze with a perfectly calm and entirely hollow expression. I did not glare at her, and I did not look down at the floor in shame. I simply watched her celebrate her total victory with the quiet patience of a man who knew the floor beneath her feet was already rapidly crumbling into dust. Beside her, Mr. Reed was acting like a conquering general who had just won a bloodless and highly profitable war. He snapped his sleek leather briefcase shut with a loud metallic click and offered his wealthy new client a highly exaggerated nod of deep professional respect. He had secured a massive payout for his firm without ever having to litigate a single difficult motion, and he was practically vibrating with pure predatory satisfaction. On my side of the aisle, the reality of the moment was completely suffocating my own attorney. Mr. Foster sat heavily in his chair, staring blankly at the empty wooden table in front of us. His face was completely pale, and his shoulders were totally hunched over in genuine professional and personal agony. He truly believed he had just failed to protect an old friend from complete financial slaughter. I desperately wanted to reach out and comfort him, but I knew I had to maintain the absolute illusion of my total defeat for just a few more crucial minutes. Barbara leaned slightly over the dividing aisle and tilted her head toward my table. She did not speak loudly enough for the judge or the court reporter to hear her, but she mouthed a few silent words directly in my direction, letting her painted lips form a cruel and highly mocking farewell. She was happily basking in the final seconds of her blissful ignorance, completely unaware that the walls of her newly acquired commercial castle were already collapsing around her. She gathered her extremely expensive designer handbag and prepared to turn her back on me forever, fully intending to walk out of those heavy wooden doors and step directly into her glamorous new billionaire lifestyle. She honestly thought the legal war was officially over, and she was the undisputed champion of the world. She had absolutely no idea that the real battle had not even started, and the weapon that would completely destroy her was currently walking rapidly down the hallway just outside the courtroom doors. Barbara shifted her weight, taking her very first confident step toward the center aisle, ready to leave me behind forever. Her expensive designer heel clicked sharply against the polished floor tiles, echoing in the quiet space. But before she could take a second step, the heavy wooden doors at the absolute back of the courtroom suddenly swung wide open. The loud creaking of the brass hinges shattered the quiet atmosphere and caused every single person in the room to freeze in their tracks. A young courier stepped inside the judicial chamber, holding a digital clipboard and looking entirely out of place in his simple gray delivery uniform. He paused for a brief moment, scanning the room full of tailored suits and dark robes. In his right hand, he clutched a very thick and heavily sealed brown envelope. The energy in the room immediately shifted from the finalized calm of a closed case to a strange and unexpected suspense. The courier began walking slowly down the center aisle of the courtroom. The rhythmic and heavy thud of his rubber sole shoes against the floor drew the absolute attention of every single eye in the room. Barbara frowned deeply and let out a dramatic sigh of pure annoyance. She was incredibly irritated that a lowly delivery worker was interrupting the glorious momentum of her grand majestic exit. Mr. Reed simply adjusted his jacket and looked mildly curious but completely unbothered by the sudden intrusion. Beside me, Mr. Foster watched the approaching man with total confusion written across his exhausted face. I remained perfectly still in my chair, keeping my breathing slow and measured. I watched the young man walk past the wooden benches carrying the exact instrument of my calculated revenge. I knew perfectly well that the envelope he was holding contained the absolute destruction of the woman standing across the aisle. The courier bypassed the wooden barrier and walked directly toward the table where my former wife and her aggressive attorney were standing. He cleared his throat and asked for Mr. Reed, specifically by his full legal name. The arrogant divorce lawyer smiled a very greasy and confident smile, fully assuming this was nothing more than the final administrative bow on his magnificent legal package. He likely thought it was just the routine banking confirmations required to close out his highly profitable afternoon. He reached out and snatched the digital clipboard from the young man, signing his name with a rapid and victorious flourish. The courier retrieved his device and handed over the heavy brown envelope without another word. He turned around and walked briskly back up the center aisle. The heavy wooden doors swung shut behind him, clicking firmly into place and completely sealing the courtroom in with the absolute truth. The brown envelope sitting in the hands of the lawyer was incredibly thick and undeniably heavy. Stamped clearly across the top left corner was the unmistakable and intimidating embossed logo of the primary institutional commercial lender I had used. It was the exact bank currently holding the massive bridge loans and the aggressive balloon mortgages. Barbara looked down at the package with incredibly hungry and eager eyes. She gently nudged her lawyer, prompting him to open it quickly so she could finally gaze upon the official confirmation of her newly acquired vast wealth. She genuinely believed those folded pages contained the golden access codes to the lucrative corporate bank accounts and the pristine, unencumbered property titles. She thought that thick stack of paper was the ultimate receipt, proving her absolute and undisputed triumph over me. She had no idea she was staring directly at a financial explosive device. Mr. Reed casually slid his manicured index finger under the thick adhesive seal of the envelope and tore it wide open. The loud ripping sound of the heavy paper tearing apart seemed to echo violently through the incredibly quiet courtroom. He reached inside and pulled out a massive and dense stack of official institutional banking documents. The very top page was a formalized summary statement of the asset transfers executed precisely at the moment the judge had struck his heavy wooden gavel. It was the legally binding paperwork that detailed the exact and current financial status of Midwest Horizon and the physical properties that were now irrevocably bound to his client. He held the pages loosely in his hands, maintaining his smug posture, completely expecting to skim through a boring list of cleared assets and finalized ownership transfers. I watched him carefully from my table as he casually flipped past the cover letter and looked down at the second page of the banking summary. He was entirely expecting to see a simple confirmation of pure liquid wealth and clear property lines. He was expecting to read a list of massive cash reserves ready to be drained by his greedy client. But he was a highly seasoned and aggressive financial lawyer, and his trained eyes knew exactly how to read a complex commercial balance sheet. His eyes immediately caught the incredibly long string of bold red numbers, printed clearly and repeatedly in the massive liability column. He stopped breathing completely. The arrogant smirk that had been plastered across his face for the entire afternoon vanished in an absolute instant. His skin lost all of its color, turning a pale and sickly shade of gray. He froze completely solid, staring at the paper as if it had suddenly caught fire in his bare hands. He started to read the fine print detailing the extreme maturity dates and the massive penalties attached to the newly transferred assets. The absolute silence in the courtroom stretched out like a thick rubber band about to snap. The magnificent illusion was finally over, and the brutal reality had officially arrived. Mr. Reed stood perfectly still, holding the thick stack of institutional banking documents. His eyes frantically darted back and forth across the top page, trying desperately to comprehend the catastrophic numbers printed in bold black ink. The confident and aggressive posture he had maintained for the entire afternoon completely dissolved. His shoulders slumped inward, and his hands began to tremble so violently that the heavy sheets of paper audibly rustled in the quiet courtroom. He flipped to the second page and then to the third page, moving with a sudden frantic panic, as if he were hoping the initial numbers were simply a typographical error. But commercial banks do not make errors of this magnitude. He was reading the certified official balance sheet of Midwest Horizon and the attached marital properties. He was looking at the exact financial reality of the empire his client had just aggressively claimed as her own. He read the column detailing the gross physical assets. The sprawling suburban mansion, the luxury car collection, and the commercial properties were officially valued at a very impressive $10 million. It was a staggering amount of wealth that perfectly matched the tax assessments they had reviewed during mediation. It was the exact number that had blinded Barbara with overwhelming greed. But Mr. Reed was a seasoned financial lawyer, and his eyes immediately dropped down to the liability section. Below the $10 million valuation was a terrifyingly long list of commercial encumbrances. There were multi-million-dollar bridge loans tied to the commercial real estate. There were massive mortgages plastered against the suburban estate. There were aggressive title loans attached to every single luxury vehicle. The total liabilities explicitly attached to the assets equaled exactly $12 million. The ruthless divorce attorney did the mental math in a fraction of a second. He realized with absolute horror that his client had not just secured a massive fortune. She had just legally assumed total ownership of a company with a negative $2 million net worth. Furthermore, he saw the distinct classification of the debt. These were not standard 30-year loans with manageable monthly payments. They were aggressive commercial balloon mortgages with a terrifyingly short maturity window. The banking documents clearly stated that the entire $12 million principal was due in exactly 45 days. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. There were no liquid cash reserves left in the corporate holding accounts to cover the debt. The accounts were entirely empty. The magnificent real estate empire was nothing more than a hollowed-out shell completely stuffed to the brim with highly toxic institutional debt. Mr. Reed felt his entire professional career flash before his eyes. He instantly remembered the tense mediation session in the private office. He remembered the specific and highly unusual addendum I had requested. I had demanded that Barbara accept the company exactly as it was and completely waive her legal right to a 90-day forensic audit. He remembered actively begging his client not to sign that specific waiver, warning her that it was an incredibly dangerous legal maneuver. But she had screamed at him to do his job and print the paperwork. She had aggressively signed her own financial death warrant just to secure a rapid and humiliating victory over me. He realized with a sickening twist in his stomach that the trap was absolutely ironclad. Because she had explicitly waived the financial discovery period, she possessed absolutely no legal recourse to claim fraud or misrepresentation. She had voluntarily and eagerly accepted the toxic debt. I remained perfectly still at my table, watching the devastating realization wash over the aggressive attorney. It was an incredibly beautiful thing to witness. The mighty legal predator who had threatened to drag my name through the mud and destroy my public reputation was currently suffocating under the weight of his own failure. He knew he was looking at the total financial annihilation of his client, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. Beside me, my own lawyer, Mr. Foster, noticed the sudden and dramatic shift in the demeanor of the opposing counsel. Mr. Foster furrowed his brow and leaned forward slightly, trying to catch a glimpse of the paperwork. He could sense that something massive had just shifted in the room, but he could not yet comprehend the sheer magnitude of my hidden strategy. He just watched in stunned silence as the arrogant divorce lawyer slowly turned into a terrified and broken man. Barbara stood right next to her attorney, completely oblivious to the catastrophic financial disaster resting in his trembling hands. She was still wearing her vibrant crimson dress and projecting an aura of absolute and supreme triumph. She looked at Mr. Reed with growing impatience, completely irritated by his sudden lack of celebratory enthusiasm. She expected him to hand over the paperwork with a massive smile and a dramatic congratulatory speech. Instead, he was staring at the documents with a pale and sickly expression, as if he were holding a live explosive device. She shifted her weight and tapped her expensive designer shoe against the polished floor tiles. She leaned closer to him and demanded to know what was taking so long. She wanted to hold the proof of her wealth and march out of the courtroom to begin her glamorous new life. She had absolutely no idea that her glamorous new life had just been violently canceled. She glared at her lawyer and sharply asked him what was wrong, completely unaware that she was standing on the very edge of a massive bottomless crater. Barbara shifted her weight in her expensive designer heels, clearly irritated by the sudden and inexplicable paralysis of her attorney. She fully expected him to turn to her with a wide, triumphant smile and offer a congratulatory handshake. She anticipated a moment of profound celebration, validating her new status as a vastly wealthy and independent woman. Instead, she was looking at a seasoned legal professional who appeared as though he were experiencing a massive and silent heart attack right there in the courtroom. She let out a sharp, audible sigh of pure exasperation. Her voice cut through the heavy, lingering silence of the judicial chamber, demanding to know why he was staring at the banking summaries as if he had just seen an apparition. She asked him what could possibly be wrong, her tone dripping with the impatient entitlement of a queen who felt she had already waited far too long to be handed her solid gold crown. She was completely oblivious to the radioactive danger resting on the table. Mr. Reed could not even bring himself to look his client directly in the eye. A thick, heavy bead of cold sweat formed at his temple and slowly rolled down his pale, ashen cheek. His entire lucrative career was built on ruthless victories, aggressive courtroom dominance, and meticulously tearing apart the assets of wealthy husbands. Now he was the lawyer who had just blindly walked his own client directly into a catastrophic financial slaughterhouse. He opened his mouth attempting to speak, but the words simply died in his dry throat. He knew the sheer devastating scale of the disaster was absolutely impossible to soften or explain away. Acting purely on primal instinct, he pulled the thick stack of banking documents slightly closer to his chest. It was a desperate and futile gesture, as if he were trying to physically shield her from the brutal reality of the catastrophic numbers printed in bold black ink on the page. That sudden defensive movement from her lawyer was the exact trigger Barbara needed to lose the absolute last shred of her public decorum. Her blinding, unadulterated greed completely hijacked her senses and overrode any sense of courtroom etiquette. She did not want to wait another single second to gaze upon the official, certified proof of her new billionaire lifestyle. She aggressively reached her manicured hands across the wooden table, intending to forcefully snatch the heavy brown envelope and the finalized balance sheets right out of his trembling grip. She desperately wanted to see the massive liquid cash reserves she assumed were sitting untouched in the corporate holding accounts. She wanted to run her fingers over the pristine, unencumbered property titles and validate her magnificent reflection in the towering numbers. She felt she had earned the right to hold the very documents that verified my absolute ruin. But Mr. Reed slammed his hands down firmly over the paperwork, pressing the documents flat against the polished mahogany table. He physically blocked her from taking the pages. It was an incredibly shocking breach of professional protocol that caused my own lawyer to sit up straight and made the judge look down from his elevated bench with intense curiosity. Barbara gasped loudly, highly offended that her hired counsel would dare to touch her or deny her immediate access to her own property. She glared at him with furious, burning eyes and ordered him to hand over the financial statements this exact instant. She was still completely trapped within her own supreme vanity, believing this was just a minor administrative clerical error, or perhaps a slight delay in the institutional wire transfers. She thought her lawyer was simply being overly cautious about filing procedures. Mr. Reed slowly looked up at her, and the expression on his face was a devastating and complex mixture of profound pity and absolute terror. He realized that screaming the truth out loud would only invite immediate public mockery and severe legal embarrassment in front of the entire court. He needed to deliver the lethal blow as quietly as humanly possible. He leaned in incredibly close to her, leaning his upper body over the table so that only she could hear the impending doom. The courtroom was so unbelievably quiet that even the sound of his ragged, panicked breathing seemed incredibly loud. He looked directly into her angry, demanding eyes, fully aware that he was about to detonate a bomb that would destroy her entirely. He swallowed hard and whispered the 4 words that permanently ended her life as she knew it. He said very clearly, "You took the debt." The air completely and violently left the room. I sat perfectly still at my table watching her brain struggle to process a financial concept that was entirely foreign to her glamorous reality. She blinked rapidly, her painted lips parting slightly, in sheer, unadulterated confusion. The 4 whispered words echoed in her mind, but her overwhelming arrogance absolutely refused to let them land. She stared back at her sweating lawyer, waiting for the punchline, waiting for him to quickly clarify that he was making a terrible and inappropriate joke. She looked closely at his pale, terrified face and saw no humor at all. She slowly looked down at the documents trapped securely under his hands, and then very slowly turned her head to look directly across the aisle at me. I offered her nothing but a cool, steady, and deeply satisfied gaze. The magnificent illusion she had built over the last 6 months finally shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The profound shock paralyzing Barbara lasted for only a few agonizing seconds before her brain finally registered the devastating magnitude of her ruined reality. The vibrant crimson dress she wore suddenly seemed less like a symbol of royal triumph and more like a massive, glaring target painted directly onto her back. She forcefully shoved her expensive leather chair away, causing it to topple backward and crash loudly against the heavy wooden barrier behind her table. The sudden, violent noise echoed like a gunshot through the incredibly quiet judicial chamber, but she did not care about courtroom decorum anymore. Her polished and sophisticated facade completely evaporated, revealing the frantic and terrified core of a woman who had just realized she was drowning in a bottomless ocean of liability. She slammed her perfectly manicured hands onto the mahogany table and let out a shrill, piercing scream that caused the court reporter to visibly flinch and pull her hands away from her keyboard. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly across the center aisle at me and began screaming at the top of her lungs. She demanded that the proceedings be immediately halted, wildly, claiming that a massive and unforgivable crime had just been committed right under the nose of the presiding legal authority. Her voice climbed to a hysterical and frantic pitch as she loudly accused me of orchestrating an elaborate and highly illegal financial fraud. She screamed that I had maliciously drained the corporate bank accounts and purposefully hidden her rightful fortune in shadow accounts overseas just to leave her destitute. She frantically begged the silver-haired judge to rip up the final settlement agreement and order the immediate arrest of the deceitful monster sitting quietly across the room. She was flailing her arms and pacing wildly behind her table, treating the formal legal setting like a chaotic street brawl. She kept shouting that the commercial properties and the luxury cars were supposed to be worth $10 million in pure liquid cash. She refused to accept the terrifying reality that the gross valuation of an asset is entirely meaningless when it is crushed beneath the staggering weight of $12 million in institutional debt. She demanded that her aggressive divorce attorney do something to freeze the transfers immediately fully, believing that a loud enough tantrum could somehow magically reverse a legally binding commercial contract. She thought she could simply scream her way out of a catastrophic multi-million-dollar disaster, just like she had screamed her way out of every other minor inconvenience in her pampered, wealthy life. The judge did not tolerate her explosive and disrespectful outburst for more than a few chaotic moments before asserting his total dominance over the room. His expression hardened into a mask of pure judicial fury, and he reached for his heavy wooden gavel once again. He struck the sound block with a rapid and deafening sequence of blows, commanding absolute order in his courtroom immediately. His deep, authoritative voice boomed over her frantic screaming, ordering her to sit down and remain completely silent or face immediate incarceration for direct contempt of court. Barbara was so entirely consumed by her overwhelming financial panic that she actually tried to argue back, but the sharp and uncompromising glare of the judge finally forced her to close her mouth. She stood trembling violently behind her table, her chest heaving as she struggled to pull oxygen into her panicked lungs. The judge then turned his fierce and unforgiving attention directly toward her sweating attorney. He demanded that Mr. Reed explicitly clarify the chaotic accusations his client was currently hurling across the room. He wanted to know right that very second if there was any actual legal basis to suggest that deliberate commercial fraud had occurred during the execution of this finalized settlement agreement. Mr. Reed looked exactly like a man walking directly toward a firing squad as he slowly stood up to address the furious judge. He cleared his throat nervously and kept his eyes firmly glued to the polished wood of his table, absolutely refusing to look at the frantic woman standing beside him. He stated in a remarkably quiet and defeated tone that there was absolutely no evidence of any legal fraud or financial misrepresentation on my part. He was forced to publicly admit that the massive commercial bridge loans and the aggressive balloon mortgages had been secured by me many months prior to the initial filing of the divorce petition. He explained to the silent courtroom that leveraging commercial real estate to generate liquid capital for future corporate investments is a perfectly standard and entirely legal business practice across the entire industry. He confirmed that all the institutional debt was legally and explicitly tied to the exact physical assets and the corporate holding company his client had so aggressively demanded to own. He had to stand there in front of the entire legal chamber and confess that I had simply acted as a highly ambitious corporate director, and that taking out massive loans on my own company was not a crime in any sense of the word. The money had been moved completely legally, and the immense liabilities were officially registered in the public commercial records long before the mediation session ever took place. Barbara let out a horrified gasp and lunged toward her own lawyer, aggressively grabbing him by the sleeve of his expensive tailored suit. She hysterically demanded to know why he had not uncovered these massive crushing debts before she signed her name on the final absolute decree. Mr. Reed gently but firmly pulled his arm away from her frantic grip, completely destroying the very last shred of her lingering hope. He turned to face her and stated the brutal, undeniable truth loud enough for the stern judge to hear perfectly clearly. He reminded her that she had been utterly obsessed with securing a rapid 30-day transfer to satisfy her own blinding vanity and her desperate need for immediate wealth. He pointed out that to achieve that reckless speed, she had explicitly commanded him to draft an addendum officially waiving her legal right to a standard 90-day forensic audit. He reminded her that he had strongly and ethically advised her against accepting a massive commercial holding company entirely as is without proper financial discovery and rigorous accounting checks. She had completely ignored his professional warnings because she was too blinded by her own overwhelming greed to inspect the corporate ledgers. She had eagerly and willingly signed away every single ounce of her own legal protection and wrapped the chains of absolute financial ruin entirely around her own neck. The inescapable trap was not built by my deception, but rather perfectly sealed by her own breathtaking arrogance and her frantic, eager signature on the final waiver. The next 30 days passed with an agonizingly slow and beautiful rhythm for me. I spent my mornings brewing simple coffee in my small apartment kitchen, and my afternoons assisting the private nurses with the physical therapy routines for my son. We celebrated small victories like Eric gaining a fraction of movement in his hand or sharing a quiet laugh over a television show. I was living a life of complete and absolute peace, entirely insulated from the impending financial explosion. But on the other side of the city, the invisible countdown clock was ticking away its final, merciless seconds. I knew exactly how the aggressive commercial banking system operated because I had used it to build my entire empire. When midnight finally struck on the 30th day, the massive bridge loans and the highly toxic balloon mortgages officially reached their absolute maturity date. The banking computers automatically searched the depleted holding accounts of Midwest Horizon for the $12 million principal payment. They found absolutely nothing but empty digital vaults and the automated system immediately triggered a catastrophic and irreversible cascade of default protocols. The trap I had so carefully set finally snapped shut with bone-crushing force. The sheer speed of commercial financial execution is something that truly must be witnessed to be fully appreciated. Long before the sun even started to rise over the city, the institutional lenders initiated emergency lockdown measures across every single asset tied to the corporate entity. All the operational bank lines were permanently frozen, and the commercial real estate deeds were instantly flagged for aggressive seizure. Barbara woke up that morning in the sprawling suburban master suite, completely unaware that the luxurious mattress she was sleeping on no longer legally belonged to her. She likely planned to spend her afternoon browsing high-end boutiques and treating her young, wealthy investor boyfriend to an extravagant lunch using the corporate cards. But when she confidently swiped her black plastic card at a local designer store, the terminal immediately declined the transaction with a loud error tone. That digital rejection was the very first drop of rain in the massive hurricane that was about to drown her entirely. Within hours, thick stacks of certified legal notices began arriving at the iron gates of the mansion, detailing the staggering default and demanding immediate total surrender of the encumbered properties. She frantically dialed the private number of her aggressive divorce lawyer, but Mr. Reed completely ignored her calls because he already knew there was absolutely no legal defense left to offer. The public humiliation she had so desperately tried to avoid hit her right in her own manicured driveway in the middle of broad daylight. Commercial lenders do not send polite letters when securing millions of dollars in highly liquid collateral, like vintage luxury automobiles. They send fleets of heavy industrial tow trucks driven by men who do not care about designer clothes or high society reputations. A convoy of massive diesel trucks rumbled into the quiet, exclusive suburban neighborhood, completely shattering the tranquil atmosphere of the elite community. I later heard from a former colleague that Barbara ran out of the massive front doors wearing an expensive silk robe and frantically waved her arms trying to stop the repossession men. She screamed at the top of her lungs and threatened to sue every single person standing on her driveway. But the recovery agents simply handed her the default warrants and continued hooking heavy steel chains to the axles of the pristine vehicles. The wealthy neighbors she had tried so desperately to impress stood on their pristine lawns and watched the incredibly embarrassing spectacle unfold. They gossiped and pointed as every single luxury car she had demanded in the divorce was mercilessly dragged away down the street, leaving long black tire marks on the concrete. The repossession of the vehicles was merely the opening act of her absolute and total destruction. The commercial banks moved swiftly to secure the most valuable asset in the entire leveraged portfolio, which was the sprawling estate itself. Because the balloon mortgage was so massively delinquent, the financial institutions easily obtained an expedited emergency foreclosure order from a local judge who had absolutely no sympathy for a woman sitting on $12 million of toxic debt. A team of stern bank representatives, flanked by uniformed county sheriffs, arrived at the front door to formally execute the immediate eviction. Barbara was handed a stark legal notice commanding her to completely vacate the premises before the sun went down. She was legally barred from removing any of the expensive custom furniture, the imported artwork, or the high-end electronics, because all of those items were explicitly tied to the commercial loans she had so eagerly absorbed in the settlement. The arrogant woman, who had proudly demanded the keys to my kingdom, was reduced to frantically stuffing her designer clothes into cheap garbage bags, while armed officers watched her every single move. She was physically escorted off the magnificent property she thought she owned, and she watched as a locksmith officially changed the deadbolts on the massive oak doors. In a state of absolute hyperventilating panic, she desperately turned to the only lifeline she thought she had left in the world. She ordered a cheap local taxi to drive her directly to the sleek downtown penthouse of the younger venture capitalist she had abandoned our 40-year marriage to be with. She knocked frantically on his door, weeping, and fully expecting him to wrap his arms around her and immediately offer his vast financial resources to save her from the aggressive commercial banks. She sat on his modern leather sofa and hysterically explained the horrifying situation, sobbing uncontrollably about the frozen accounts, the massive liability, and the sudden, devastating eviction. But the young investor was a man who lived and breathed calculated financial risk, and he took one look at the staggering numbers she presented and saw a massive toxic contagion. He realized instantly that she was not a wealthy independent real estate queen, but a completely bankrupt liability who would drag his own lucrative career directly into the mud. He did not offer her a warm embrace or a single penny of support. He coldly told her to gather her trash bags and leave his apartment immediately, permanently severing their relationship before the ink on her eviction notice was even completely dry. She was left standing entirely alone on a cold concrete sidewalk in the middle of the city, realizing she had traded a loyal family for a man who only loved the illusion of her wealth. It was late on a dreary Thursday evening when the relentless pounding echoed against the thin wooden door of my modest rental apartment. The sound was frantic and chaotic, completely out of place in the quiet working-class hallway. I was sitting at the small kitchen table reviewing the latest encouraging medical reports from the private nurses regarding the steady progress of my son. I slowly placed the paperwork down and walked toward the entrance, fully expecting to find a confused delivery driver or a neighbor locked out of their unit. I turned the simple brass lock and opened the door to find the absolute ghost of my former wife standing under the flickering fluorescent light of the corridor. Barbara was completely unrecognizable from the radiant and arrogant queen who had proudly stomped out of the courthouse just 30 days ago. Her hair was drenched from the freezing rain, and her face was streaked with dark trails of ruined expensive makeup. She was wearing a cheap, wrinkled coat over clothes she had clearly pulled in a frantic panic from black garbage bags. The absolute devastation of her total financial ruin had physically aged her a decade in a matter of weeks, and she was shivering violently on my cheap welcome mat. She did not wait for me to invite her inside before she launched into a hysterical and deeply pathetic performance. She immediately collapsed against the doorframe and began sobbing with a loud, exaggerated wail that echoed down the quiet apartment hallway. She reached out with her trembling hands and desperately tried to grab onto my simple cotton sweater, begging me to please listen to her for just one single minute. She poured out a frantic flood of fabricated apologies, claiming that she had been entirely brainwashed and manipulated by the toxic younger investor who had just thrown her out onto the wet city street. She weaponized the memory of our 40-year marriage, pleading with me to remember the good times we shared and the wonderful life we had built together from the ground up. She swore that she now realized what a terrible, catastrophic mistake she had made by trusting the aggressive divorce lawyer who had led her directly into the massive commercial trap. She cried out that she had absolutely nowhere else to go and that her bank accounts were completely frozen, leaving her without a single penny to buy food or secure a safe hotel room. She was practically begging on her knees for a financial bailout, hoping my supposed weakness for her would suddenly reappear and save her from the cold, concrete reality of brutal poverty. I did not step aside to let her into the warmth of my home, and I absolutely refused to offer her any physical comfort. I simply stood my ground, perfectly centered, in the narrow doorway, acting as an unbreakable human shield between her toxic desperation and the peaceful sanctuary I had built for my son. I looked down at her tear-stained face and felt absolutely nothing. There was no lingering affection, no trace of pity, and certainly no desire to rescue her from the devastating consequences of her own blinding greed. I knew perfectly well that her frantic tears were not born out of genuine remorse for the profound pain she had caused our family during the ruthless divorce mediation. She was only crying because her luxurious lifestyle had violently evaporated, and the harsh consequences of her supreme arrogance had finally caught up to her. I maintained my absolute silence, letting her desperate pleas hang uselessly in the cold, damp air of the corridor. I watched her frantically search my calm, unbothered expression for any tiny sliver of mercy or hesitation. As she slowly realized that her dramatic tears were completely failing to penetrate my cold logic, her posture shifted from pathetic sorrow to a calculated and incredibly disgusting new strategy. When the fabricated tears of a discarded wife failed to move me, she immediately pivoted to the most repulsive manipulation tactic imaginable. She abruptly stopped her loud sobbing and wiped her face, trying to assemble a mask of profound maternal concern. She looked past my shoulder, attempting to peer into the dim hallway of the small apartment, and softly called out the name of our disabled son. She clasped her hands together over her chest and told me she had experienced a massive spiritual awakening while sitting alone on the cold city sidewalk. She swore that losing the sprawling mansion and the luxury cars had finally made her realize that family was the only true wealth in the entire world. She begged me to let her walk into the second bedroom so she could hold the hand of the boy she had so recently abandoned. She actually offered to stay in the cramped rental apartment and become the dedicated full-time caregiver for Eric, promising to help with his intensive physical therapy and his daily medical needs. She was desperately trying to use the broken body of our child as a convenient human shield to secure a warm bed and a roof over her head, entirely weaponizing her discarded title as a mother just to save herself from the local homeless shelter. The sheer audacity of her maternal facade triggered a massive wave of protective disgust deep within my chest, but I kept my breathing perfectly steady and my voice incredibly low. I looked at the woman who had explicitly refused to take on any physical or financial responsibility for a paralyzed man just 6 months ago. I calmly reminded her of the exact harsh words she had so proudly spoken while standing in the grand kitchen of the suburban estate when she first demanded the divorce. I repeated her cruel phrases verbatim, reminding her that she had called our boy a bottomless money pit and a depressing anchor holding her back from her glamorous new life. I told her that my son was currently resting in a state-of-the-art medical sanctuary, funded by a bulletproof trust and surrounded by a team of elite private nurses who actually cared about his survival. I made it absolutely clear that her toxic presence would never be allowed to contaminate the air he breathed ever again. I told her that she had completely forfeited any right to call herself his mother the very second she demanded the commercial holding company over his physical recovery. She had played her absolute final card, and it had failed spectacularly, leaving her with nothing but the cold, hard truth of her permanent exile. I watched her standing there on the cheap welcome mat under the flickering fluorescent light of the hallway. The woman who had proudly marched down the sweeping, curved staircase of our mansion just months ago was completely gone. In her place stood a shivering and desperate stranger entirely consumed by the consequences of her own blinding greed. Her expensive designer coat was soaked through with freezing city rain and clung awkwardly to her trembling frame. The luxurious lifestyle she had so aggressively demanded had violently evaporated, leaving behind nothing but the harsh physical reality of her sudden and total ruin. She had tried to weaponize my disabled child to secure a warm bed and a roof over her head, assuming that my decades of quiet loyalty meant I was inherently weak. She believed she could simply flip a switch and manipulate my emotions, expecting that I would inevitably cave to the sight of her tears. She looked up at me with smeared makeup and shaking hands, waiting for the familiar comfort of a husband who had spent a lifetime quietly fixing her mistakes. But she was looking at a man who no longer existed. The man she had married died the exact moment she called our helpless boy a burden. The man standing in the doorway was simply the architect of her absolute destruction. I did not raise my voice or offer a single syllable of anger. Anger requires a level of emotional investment that I simply no longer possessed for her. I let the heavy and absolute silence of the corridor stretch out for a long, agonizing moment, letting the sheer gravity of her failure press down on her shoulders. I wanted her to feel the crushing weight of the impenetrable barrier I had erected between us. I wanted her to look into my eyes and see absolutely nothing but the cold, hard reflection of her own catastrophic choices. She slowly stopped her frantic pleading as the chilling reality of my unbothered silence finally began to penetrate her deep panic. Her trembling hands fell uselessly to her sides, and her shoulders slumped forward in total defeat. She realized with a sudden and terrifying clarity that there was no hidden reserve of mercy left for her to exploit. The immense fortune she thought she had stolen was completely gone. The glamorous new partner she had abandoned her family for was completely gone. And now the safety net of my unconditional protection was also permanently gone. She was entirely alone in the toxic and hollow universe she had so arrogantly created for herself. I looked directly into her eyes, making sure she was fully present and completely aware of the absolute finality of this moment. I did not want there to be a single shred of misunderstanding between us regarding who was ultimately responsible for her current misery. I kept my posture perfectly still and my voice incredibly low and steady, commanding her complete attention without needing to shout. I spoke slowly and carefully, enunciating every single word so they would imprint themselves permanently into her memory for the rest of her miserable life. I reminded her that she had walked into the grand kitchen of our estate and aggressively demanded the house, the luxury cars, and the entire commercial empire. I reminded her that she had been utterly ruthless in her negotiations, entirely eager to leave her own disabled flesh and blood behind to fund her glamorous new lifestyle. I looked at her shivering in her wet coat, and I delivered the absolute and final verdict of our 40-year marriage. I told her in a voice devoid of any pity or compassion that she wanted everything except the son, and she got exactly what she asked for. The words landed with the devastating force of a physical blow, completely shattering whatever remaining fragments of hope she was clinging to. I watched the last spark of entitlement completely extinguish from her dark eyes, leaving behind nothing but the hollow stare of a totally broken woman. Her mouth opened slightly, but she was utterly incapable of forming a single coherent response to defend herself. She knew with absolute terrifying certainty that every single thing I had just said was undeniably true. She had eagerly demanded the empty shell of a heavily leveraged empire, and she had aggressively abandoned her only child to secure it. She was not a victim of a cruel scheme or a tragic legal misunderstanding. She was the sole and exclusive author of her own total destruction. She stood frozen on the concrete walkway, completely paralyzed by the crushing realization that she had outsmarted absolutely no one but herself. She had reached the absolute dead end of her toxic manipulation, and there was no way out. There were no more lawyers to bully, no more judges to deceive, and no more hidden assets to seize. There was only the cold, damp reality of the unforgiving city street waiting for her outside. I did not wait for her to gather her thoughts or attempt another pathetic string of fabricated apologies. I had given her exactly the amount of time and energy she deserved, which was practically nothing. I slowly reached for the edge of the simple wooden door, keeping my movements steady and entirely unbothered. I did not slam it shut in a fit of dramatic rage or pound my fist against the frame to make a point. I closed it with a smooth, calm, and deliberate motion that signaled the absolute end of our connection. I watched her pale and horrified face gradually disappear behind the closing wood until the visual connection between us was completely and permanently severed. The heavy brass lock clicked into place with a sharp, crisp sound that echoed beautifully in the small entryway of my apartment. It was the exact sound of absolute closure and total liberation. I stood in the quiet warmth of my home for a brief moment, listening to the muffled sound of her quiet sobbing bleeding through the thin walls of the corridor. I felt no urge to open the door again, and I felt absolutely no guilt for the tears she was shedding. The chapter of my life containing Barbara was officially and irrevocably finished, and I was walking away the undisputed victor. I turned my back to the locked door and walked slowly down the short hallway of the modest rental unit. The stark contrast between the frantic, toxic energy of the woman outside and the profound, peaceful sanctuary inside was incredibly striking. The air in my home was warm and clean, completely free from the suffocating vanity that used to dictate my every waking moment. I moved toward the small kitchen table where I had been reviewing the highly promising medical reports from the elite private nurses. I sat down in my simple wooden chair and picked up the paperwork once again, adjusting my glasses to read the latest updates. I smoothed out the pages and looked at the positive mobility metrics, documenting the steady and miraculous recovery of my son. The tens of millions of dollars I had safely hidden away in the irrevocable trust were working perfectly in the background, ensuring that he would always be comfortable, secure, and protected from any financial harm. I had successfully navigated the most dangerous financial and emotional minefield of my entire life, and I had emerged completely unscathed. I took a deep, slow breath of the quiet apartment air, feeling a profound and unshakable sense of tranquility settle deep into my bones. I had sacrificed an empty empire to save my own flesh and blood, and sitting there in that quiet, modest kitchen, I knew I was the richest man in the world. The morning sun poured through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the elite neurological rehabilitation center, bathing the polished hardwood floors in a warm and brilliant golden light. It was an environment completely unlike the cold, sterile hospitals we had visited in the agonizing months immediately following the accident. This facility was a private sanctuary of healing situated on a quiet and heavily wooded campus, far away from the chaotic noise of the city. The air inside smelled of fresh pine and clean linen, completely devoid of the sharp antiseptic odors that usually accompany severe medical trauma. I sat quietly on a comfortable, padded bench situated in the corner of the expansive physical therapy gymnasium, holding a simple cup of black coffee. I watched the highly trained specialists move around the room with absolute professional grace. Every single piece of cutting-edge robotic mobility equipment and every hour of dedicated private nursing care was paid for completely in full by the bulletproof, irrevocable trust. I did not have to worry about insurance deductibles or aggressive corporate billing departments. I did not have to fight with hospital administrators over the duration of his stay or the quality of his daily physical therapy. I simply watched the quiet machinery of limitless financial security operate exactly as I had engineered it to do. It was the ultimate invisible shield completely protecting him from the harsh economic realities of catastrophic injury. In the very center of the sunlit room, my 38-year-old son was gripping the heavy steel rails of the parallel walking bars. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and the muscles in his arms trembled violently under the sheer physical exertion of supporting his own body weight. The catastrophic damage to his spine had forced him to completely relearn the most fundamental mechanics of human movement. I watched his intense concentration, feeling an overwhelming wave of profound, paternal pride swell deep inside my chest. He possessed an unbreakable fighting spirit that could never be bought or sold in a corporate boardroom. He did not complain about the grueling pain, and he did not ask for pity from the therapists standing closely by his side. He just gritted his teeth and focused his entire existence on commanding his broken legs to move forward. This grueling, honest labor was the absolute antithesis of the hollow, superficial life his mother had so desperately chased. While she had sacrificed her entire family just to secure a massive illusion of unearned wealth, my son was fighting tooth and nail to earn every single inch of his miraculous recovery. He was demonstrating a level of raw, personal character and deep inner strength that Barbara was entirely incapable of comprehending. The lead physical therapist slowly raised his hands and signaled for the supporting medical team to take a small, deliberate step backward. The entire gymnasium seemed to hold its collective breath as the heavy safety harnesses were gently unclipped from the overhead tracking system. Eric was entirely untethered, standing on his own 2 feet for the very first time in over 8 agonizing months. The quiet hum of the ventilation system was the only sound left in the massive sunlit room. I leaned forward on my bench, gripping the ceramic coffee cup so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white. Eric took a deep, ragged breath and stared intensely at a fixed point on the far brick wall. He slowly released his tight grip on the right steel rail and then carefully let go of the left. He swayed for a terrifying fraction of a second, finding his precise center of gravity. Then, with agonizing and beautiful precision, he lifted his right foot and placed it firmly on the solid floor ahead of him. He shifted his weight and successfully pulled his left leg forward, completing his very first entirely unassisted step. He took another step and then another, proving to the entire watching world that his unbending willpower was infinitely stronger than the devastating tragedy that had tried to claim his life. Tears silently spilled over my lower eyelids and tracked slowly down my weathered cheeks, but I made absolutely no effort to wipe them away. I sat there in the corner of the bright gymnasium and let the profound reality of my absolute victory completely wash over me. I looked at the incredible miracle of my son walking proudly across the room, and I thought about the exact heavy price I had paid to secure this precise moment in time. I had willingly surrendered a towering commercial real estate empire that I had spent 40 grueling years building from scratch. I had permanently walked away from a fleet of pristine vintage automobiles and a sprawling suburban mansion filled with imported marble and custom woodwork. I had allowed a toxic and relentlessly greedy woman to publicly humiliate me in a mediation room, and I had let the high society circles of Chicago believe I was a defeated and bankrupt fool. But looking at the steady rise and fall of my son's chest, I knew with absolute unshakable certainty that I had executed the greatest transaction in the history of commercial finance. I had traded a mountain of cold, hollow concrete and highly toxic institutional debt for the warm, beating heart of my only child. It was not a sacrifice at all. It was the absolute, undeniable bargain of a lifetime. Eric reached the absolute end of the parallel bars and let out a breathless, exhausted laugh that filled the quiet room with pure, unadulterated joy. The surrounding therapists erupted into genuine loud applause, but I simply stood up and walked slowly across the polished floor toward him. The bitter memory of Barbara and the venomous threats she had screamed through my apartment door felt like a distant and entirely irrelevant nightmare. She was permanently trapped in the dark, chaotic prison tongue of her own crushing financial consequences, completely erased from the bright and hopeful reality we now safely inhabited. I reached out and wrapped my arms around the strong, trembling shoulders of my son, feeling the solid proof of my life's best work breathing steadily against my chest. I did not need a heavy gold pen, a luxury suburban estate, or a massive corporate title to define my value as a man. I had successfully protected my flesh and blood from absolute ruin and engineered a flawless fortress of peace that no amount of hostile greed could ever breach. I closed my eyes in the warm, pouring sunlight, knowing that the long, brutal war was officially over, and I had undeniably won the only prize that ever truly mattered.